Everyone, welcome back. Welcome back, welcome back. We are so glad that we're getting closer to being on schedule. So we're moving through our day quite well, and thank you so much for making an effort to get back in the room. Before I welcome our next speakers, there's two things I want to say. One, we would encourage you to tweet, to share pictures of today, share quotes. One of my favorite quotes from the last discussion was, "It takes more resources to block free trade than it takes to allow it." And so when you hear things that are worth sharing, we encourage you to share it. The second thing that I want to say is this is the microphone that we will be using for Q&A. And so whenever we get to Q&A at different points in the day and you'd like to ask a question, you'll raise your hand and someone will toss this to you and you'll speak right into the box right here like that. So that's a demonstration for you. It really does work. So this is our catch box. Feel free to throw it around. You probably can't break it. So without further ado, our next time will feature two discussions. And so we've got our first discussion with only two people. And after they're finished, we ask that you keep your seats because we've got another discussion immediately following. So our next guest speaker is Mr. Akeem Bello-Osagie. And the dean will be in conversation with him, and he will give him a more formal introduction. But I would like to welcome Akeem Bello-Osagie and Dean Peter Tufano to the stage.
Okay. Oh, they switched our glasses out. Okay. Oh, long way down. Good afternoon. Do you think that's lackluster?
No, I don't. I just think that at that time in the morning at which we've got to pep them up a bit.
Okay. Good morning. Much better. Okay. So we're thrilled here to have Akeem Bello-Osagie back in Oxford. What's the back about? So he graduated studying PPE from Balliol College, my college, which is great. And some of you enjoyed that last night. He also decided that he had to supplement his education with a couple of inferior organizations. So he also got a law degree from Cambridge and an MBA from Harvard. We all have to do what we have to do. In any event, Akeem is the chairman of Metis Capital Partners. He was the chairman of the board of Emerging Markets Telecommunications. He chairs the board of Vitol Nigeria, the Nigerian subsidiary of the Vitol Group and Chocolate City Group. He's the main stakeholder in and chair of the board of Duval Properties. He's a member of the Global Board of Advisors for the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Advisory Council, the Brookings Institute, and much, much more. Akeem is extraordinarily well-respected business person, entrepreneur, and thinker for Africa. But I want to start a long time ago, if we can. We can start now, all the things you're thinking about, and for sure we have to talk about the free trade agreement. But I want to take the clock back to when you were in their seats, when you were an MBA or a law student, and what you thought the future held for you and how it has played out relative to that 20-something vision of what you thought the future held.
I'll answer that question in two parts. 1973, Balliol College, we had just had the major increase in oil prices. There was this organization called OPEC, which had in many ways transformed the terms of trade. And for the first time, we used to call them third world countries, appeared to be in the driver's seat. So for all of us Africans, and we had a very thriving African society, we felt that we were at the cusp of a major revolution in our country's fortunes. And the way we saw it, we somewhat modestly regarded ourselves as among the best and the brightest who were going to go back to our countries and were to make our countries great countries. So I would say that back in 76, meeting the Ugandans, the Kenyans, the Ghanaians, we had a great sense of all of us going back to our countries, having learned lessons from each other's. And we saw, in many senses, the government as the vehicle for development. So that was how I felt 73 to 76. Then I went to business school. In between the time I had left Balliol and gone to business school, there was a wave of instability in a lot of African countries. There was the Ethiopian Revolution. Mm-hmm. There was Amin in Uganda. There were coups d'etats in Nigeria. There were coups d'etats in Ghana. And so by 1980, when I was leaving business school, my thinking had very much changed. And it was, yes, the government is very important, but that the remaking of the African continent is going to be led by business groups. The MBA at that time was very new, all right? And I remember at that time, I think that out of a class of 1,600 students, there were only 2 students from Africa, myself and Bayo Ogunlesi. And therefore, we saw it as a rather lonely journey that we're going to pursue, but that was the way we're going to go, which was to try to remake our continents through the business community, and to do that along the lines of a business education that made us think through these matters carefully and with great diligence. So in that regard, I do want all of you to know that it is a great privilege and honor for me to be in a place at which interest in Africa can fill not just a room in a college, but can actually fill an auditorium. So I'm delighted and honored that you're all here today.
As are we. So you have this, not revelation, but notion that business is going to be the force for changing Africa. How does that play out in your career?
I think, if anything, I'm even more convinced about it now than I was in 1980. I think, going back to 1980, the state corporation was the vehicle for a lot of development in a lot of African countries. So if you look at banking, for example, in Nigeria, it was the state in joint venture with international banks. If you look at the copper industry, look at the oil industry, there were state corporations that were the vehicle. But I think it soon became very, very clear that a lot of those state industries were not well run. They became loss-making. Key appointments in those industries were made by politicians. They became a source of patronage. And the thrust for privatization, in my view, was done less for ideological reasons, but simply because the state enterprises were losing so much money that the state could no longer do it. Today, we see the same thing playing out with South African Airways. So I think that one of the high points for me in my own life was my participation in the privatization of the United Bank of Africa. Because that was a case in which a group of us were buying a bank that had been run by the state, that was bankrupt. In fact, everything in it was wrong, all right? And the work that we did in turning around that bank against tremendous opposition from the government, tremendous investigation by the security agencies, opposition from the trade unions, opposition from those people who had been there for so many years and had so much vested interests. And it was turning that around that for me is one of the high points of my life. One of the most difficult high points, and along that way, we had many setbacks and many failures. And so one of the reasons why I always tell students that I meet is that failure is good for you, not too much, but you can't have too little. You'll encounter those things in your careers, and there are some lessons that you can only learn through harsh failures, because harsh failures have a way of cementing a lesson in your mind and in your heart that just having Dean Tufano tell you not to do it won't do.
But dealing with failure is difficult. So people find different sources of resilience. What's your source of resilience when you're facing the troubles that you faced, because the UBA kind of privatization was not a simple one. So where do you find that inspiration or resilience to come back and deal with things?
I think that different people look for their inspiration from different sources. In my particular case, I'm a person who enjoys reading biographies and autobiographies. And I find that reading what other people have gone through, it has a way of sort of telling you that, my God, I think I have problems. And in fact, one of the stories I like to tell is that I was here at Balliol, very first week that I was here. A professor is telling all of us that there are very few certainties in life. And then he says to us that, let us imagine what are the 5 certainties of life. And he listed the 5 certainties, and all of us agreed about them. So I'll just tell you 2 or 3 of the certainties that he said that we agreed with. One certainty was that, Akeem, while you're very involved in the protests at the university for sanctions against South Africa, in your lifetime, you're not going to be able to walk the streets of Cape Town because the apartheid regime cannot be overthrown. Now, we all agreed, but on my wife's 40th birthday, we won the streets of Cape Town.
Which was just a few years ago, by the way.
Another one was that while Oxford is now taking women, 20% in those days, we're not going to see a female prime minister in Great Britain. And another one was that while Martin Luther King has won the Nobel Prize, we will not in our lifetime see a black president of the United States. Now, so when I'm in a really bad spot, I just say to myself, now, 76, there's Mandela. He's probably in his 6th or 7th year in detention. He's got another 20 more years to go. Now, is my situation, does it look any more bleak than that? Now, of course, on such occasions, my wife, in that tone of undeceived respect that is a characteristic of wives, she may look at me and say, but you're not Nelson Mandela. Nonetheless, the point to be made for me is that that's my source. For some people, it's religion. For some people, it's their parents or it's their friends who cheer them up. For some, it's a spouse. For me, it's a combination of those, but reading what other people have been through is my strongest inspiration.
I think yesterday, in addition to being International Women's Day, was actually also World Book Day. So thanks for putting those together. By the way, just to put this historically in context, when you arrived in Balliol in '73, it would be another 7 years before the first woman would be admitted.
Yeah.
So it's in our lifetimes that this has happened. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the free trade agreement and the kind of our work at hand.
Yes.
So we've had some discussion earlier about the potential of this, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, bringing the countries together. So what will it take for this agreement to succeed?
Without doubt, this agreement opens the continent to tremendous possibilities. That size of a market, the ability for organizations to see that they can supply a market of that size can only be beneficial. No doubt about that. But when you look again, and this time not so much biography, maybe history, at what made a success of the European market, what made a success of the Latin American market, what made a success of the ASEAN zone in Southeast Asia, you will find that there was a strong political will in which political leaders defined that creation as something for which there was an existential need. In short, we have to do this. And they had to form within the area and the community a very powerful and strong feeling that it was necessary for them, for political reasons, to do it. Now, in the case of Europe, it's 15, 20, 30 million people dead in the Second World War, and France and Germany, who had been historic enemies, coming together and saying, let us create a unity in our economies and spread that around Europe, and that very much formed the basis for that. Mm-hmm. In the United States and Latin America, you had the United States trying to organize Latin America together, and in ASEAN, it was a response to what was perceived as a communist threat, and how do we have our economies successful in the face of a China or an India. Now, I think that Africa and African leaders, they have to define why it is politically imperative for this to take place. I think the problem that you see in Nigeria is not so much that Nigerians are, or the Nigerian community is opposed to it, but because if you read the Nigerian newspapers for 30 successive days, you will hardly see a front page story that says, onwards and upwards into the African community. You'll read about all sorts of things, but it's not something that is engaging the minds of the leadership in Nigeria. And I think that creating that political imperative is important. Otherwise, the obstacles for unity will not be overcome. So that is number one. Then the second thing that I think is very important is creating a community of younger people who are going into business or are in the middle of business corporations who have an African mindset, all right, who can think beyond their regions. Because let's not forget, for most of us Africans here, we are still struggling with Yoruba versus Hausa Fulani, Kikuyu versus Luo. We're still struggling with Xhosa versus Zulu. So we're barely overcoming that. So I'm just imagining that, you know, for the Tanzanian or the Malawian or the guy from Upper Volta, the Nigerians. You know? It must be a bit of a stretch. So for me, I would say I became an African, funnily enough, when I got to Oxford. Because that was the first time I met other African students. And I found so much that we had in common, we had differences, but my Africanness derived from my time here. And therefore, I think that the function of places like Said, and it's something that I want all of you to leave with, is for you to become Africans. And you become Africans because simply by living together, studying together, arguing together, some of you dating together, you begin in a very real way to have a very different perspective. And having perspectives like this is what creates the groundwork, the attitude towards thinking, let me see Africa as my vista, and let me trade within Africa. So I think those are the 2 points for me that I often see missing in discussions that I think are essential for success in the African Common Trade Zone.
Great. Hence, by the way, the connection with the after party this evening. Let's talk about trying to make the investment landscape more effective in Africa. You and I were talking before, and we were talking about the importance of various elements to make that work better, even with the free trade agreement. One of them was transparency. What do you see are the impediments to making investments move more fluidly in the continent and making so that capital's going to the right places,
Well, there are several, but 2 come to mind for me. The first is just this issue of transparency and regulation. And whenever you acquire a company, or whenever you go into a joint venture with a company, and a lot of times the process of moving to another country is going to be via a joint venture. It's going to be via an acquisition. There's always the issue of the dreaded due diligence. Am I buying what I think I'm buying? All right? You know, how can I trust? I don't even trust the regulator in my own country all the time. I'm remembering that this is going through live feed. Can I, you know, can I trust that the regulatory framework, the accounting framework, can ensure that these are accounts that I can believe in? And my friend Akeem Bello-Osagie, who's one of Nigeria's most boldest bankers, I think has been through this kind of thing in acquiring institutions. You find that they're not what you thought they were, and you have to keep your mouth shut, look happy, while you're pedaling furiously to solve the problem of this whole, and while people are getting very upset with you because they feel you have gigantic visions. Okay? So that is a central impediment. Then the second impediment that I see, which links to what I said earlier on, is that it also involves, again, partnering with people and your ability to think beyond yourself and beyond your own culture. And how does a Nigerian go to Tanzania, okay, and work with individuals within Tanzania, learn how the society is? Yes, it's another African country, but African countries are still very different in many respects. And therefore, just as we often say that American companies and European companies who come to Africa need to learn to Africans, the fact of the matter is that Nigerians, Ghanaians, Tanzanians moving to other African countries need the same mindset to do so as well.
I have about an hour more questions. But what we agreed was that I would turn it over at this point to you because you're the brilliant minds of the day, and I want you to have a chance to ask Akeem some great questions. So if I'd ask for 3 quick rules: 1, give your name; 2, make it a question; and 3, make it short. And I'll just kind of elaborate on this catchbox thing. You're not going to hurt the catchbox, but you will hurt one another if you throw it at somebody who's not looking. So just be careful. Who'd like to start? Yes, the woman over there in the gray. Hold on.
It's okay. Okay. Hello, my name is Manuela. I am Eritrean, even if I was born in Italy, so I'm also Italian. Thanks for this opportunity because it's, I believe, really useful for everyone. I love the concept that you expressed at the beginning when you say that, we can develop Africa using, business people, this is quite right. But still, I believe that, this continent has a big issue. That is, the political system that we have across this continent, excluding few exceptions. In reality, what I believe is that one of the biggest limits for this single market is the current political situation in the African continent. We are seeing a lot of people in diaspora that, they want to bring the big change, probably even people in the continent, but still we have a big issue that is the political system. How do you think the African politicians, leaders, will, work in this single market? Because in my opinion, they are the biggest challenge and risk of this, big project.
All right then. I said earlier on that 73, I thought, and I saw the government as the root. And I changed at a later stage in which I saw business at the root. Now, I would say to you, I've probably changed again. And right now, my thinking is that change has to take place at two levels, at the level of government and the level of business. And they have to go simultaneously. And that however successful businessmen can be, if you do not have a government that takes care of security, takes care of infrastructure, takes care of education, then business will not be able to flourish, and you have the danger that you have a country of oligarchs, and that the working classes, peasant classes, are left out of that development. Okay? And ultimately, a country, in my view, is judged, its success is judged by how well the bottom 40% of the community fares, not by how many successful businessmen there are. That can actually be a sign of dysfunction. Okay? So, to the specific question you have asked, I've said my sense about it is that more people who are able, who are committed, who are educated, and who are intelligent need to go into politics and government. I don't think that those areas can be changed from outside. Now, of course, my sternest critic, which is my wife, who's sitting here, will say, and you're saying this? Now, not everybody is suited to going to politics, just as not everybody is suited to going to education. But I would say that if there are people in this room who, with their education about business, with their knowledge of international affairs, that it's important that some of you go into the bureaucracy, some of you go into elective politics, because we must have the kind of political leaders who appreciate the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Great, thank you. Okay, second question. How about the gentleman over here on the aisle? So
I am dangerous, huh?
Whoa! Yes, you are. So back over there. So it's please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Tobechukwu Nelly. I'm an African Initiative for Governance scholar at the Blavani School of Government. My scholarship is funded by a couple of private sector players, led by Mr. Akeem Bello-Osagie. So my question has to do with the last point you made about having people of similar competence in the public sector. This flows from, of course, the idea of the African Initiative for Governance. And my sense is that both the private sector and the public sector shouldn't be at loggerheads, and they should be able to complement each other in order to enhance development in the society. From your experience, what would you consider to be one of the most critical challenges that has made this difficult?
Has made what difficult?
Made collaboration between the public and private sector difficult.
I think that it is both sides view each other as a very mysterious, a very strange animal that is dangerous, that is there to wreak havoc on them, and that probably represents some of the not too good aspects of society. I worked for 6 years in government. In fact, when I left Harvard Business School, I went straight into the government. And when I recall a lot of my meetings with the government, it was constantly about these dangerous businessmen who want to get away with murder and how we're going to control them. Now, the good thing for me was that I was the only one in my class who went to government. In fact, my friends who were in the private sector regarded me as absolutely mad. They'd always regarded me as a bit bizarre, but this confirmed it. And so I used to go back from work and go and see them in the evening, because I didn't have any social friends in the government. And when I got back home and I sat with them, I was sort of reminded that they were not these dangerous animals that I had heard about during my working days. Now, on the side of the business community, again, sometimes the business community doesn't accept that we have a lot of folks who have very crooked tendencies amongst ourselves, and who, if given a chance, will go haywire. And they too have this attitude as well to government as people who are just not willing to, quote unquote, cooperate or do what is necessary. So I think that both sides have to have an appreciation that there will be a tension between both of the sides, but both sides have an important role to play that is most times complementary, sometimes it is antagonistic, but that we have to work it out somehow. Now, there's one comment you made which I just want to correct, and my fellow businessmen should not be upset by what I'm going to say. You said that it's important that people in government are of equal competence to people in the private sector. I genuinely believe that in actual fact, government requires more intelligent people than the private sector. Because you see, the problems that a government official faces, they are far more difficult, complex, far more challenging. I mean, when I would think of some of the issues that I've had to confront when I was in the government, to be honest with you, I haven't confronted as big a problem, all right, intellectually, all right, when I was in the private sector. Working out what kind of education system is suitable for 60 million people. How do you deliver education at X price of Y quality to this amount of people? It's a little bit more challenging and complicated than the issue of, you know, how I sell my telephones and the distribution network that's required, all right? Or how do I avoid bad loans in the bank? Those are difficult problems to face, and they have to be faced, but paradoxically, government does require first-rate minds. And if you look at countries like Japan, okay, the civil servants from the University of Tokyo, you look at France, those from the Grande École, you look at Great Britain, some would argue that something has gone wrong, given Brexit and all. But if you look at most of the successful developed countries in the world, and China is there, all have had a core of truly outstanding bureaucrats who have excellent minds, who have been able to grapple with serious problems.
Which is why we're thrilled that, how many of you are from the Blazotnik School, by the way? Excellent, welcome. Glad you're here. I'm told that we have a few minutes left, so let's do this. Let's take 2 or 3 questions.
Yes. Okay.
And then...
And could I just suggest that the questions are from non-Nigerians?
Okay. So...
Because they can always see me in Lagos or Abuja.
All right, fine. So non-Nigerians, let's start with this woman here. So ask your question, and then we'll do 2 or 3 more. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then we'll collect them and answer them.
Thank you, Hakeem. My name is Winnie Moreithi. I'm a Kenyan, but also an African. So the context of my question is this. Sorry, I'm the one talking.
Where are you? Oh, yes, okay, yes.
Over there.
Yes.
My question is simple. China, is it a blessing or a curse?
Okay, China, blessing or curse. Next question right here, this gentleman right here. So if you can just pitch that, oh, actually the blue one. Behind you, actually only one of you. There you go. Okay.
Hi, my name is Nenye Osayasari. I'm from Ghana. And this was a question we've looked at the polar opposites in terms of government and the private sector. I'm thinking more along the lines of the general public in terms of moving a consensus towards the direction that we're trying to get to. How do you feel that we as a people can change the consensus that we currently are in terms of improving our relationships with other countries within the continent?
Okay.
And how do you feel, in terms of religious leaders, an impact that they might play given our propensity to be very religious?
Very
religious.
Okay.
Okay, and then in front, this woman here. Last word goes to you, or last question at least.
My name is Tarhas, and I'm from Eritrea. I have been out of my country, and my country is now had made a gross change by just and my government has no budget. And the only thing that we have, at least the government had been good, is in terms of security. All the other things we had, like health, education. So now, one of the things sometimes I'm faced, because I have been following the climate change negotiation from 2004, and I'm a member of the African negotiators. And for me, I feel, first of all, I think, like I say to myself, maybe we should use climate change to sort of, formulate a model in order to stimulate the economy. I mean, like, it's going to be so difficult for a country like Eritrea, which has so much potential in, by way of, like, port development or, lots of things. That is one. And second, because as I said, like I have been following this, I think Africa is in a better position now because not only has it got the natural resources, it has got also the human resources. And what is wrong is with the West, they don't realize that there is this thing. And we need to tell whoever is the West that we don't need you, we can manage. On our own, because it's true, we could do it on our own. Because I see in this climate change negotiation, up to now, I mean, what Africa needs is like a very strong.
And excuse me, the question is.
Please forgive Terhas for speaking to us in this way. Terhas was doing her A-levels in Oxford when I was a student here. And so we have been friends since 72.
Excellent.
So she has the right to talk to me anyhow.
Excellent. So I think we have 3 C's. We have climate change, 4 C's. Climate change, consensus, China.
China, yes, okay. So climate change, Terhas. Terhas, you are very right that a lot of African countries are not taking climate change seriously. It reminds me very much about how when we were here in the early 70s, we took the environment. And whenever people would say to us, we'd go for this lecture and someone would talk about the environment and how we needed to slow growth. And then the African students, we would sort of leave and we'd sort of huddle together and we'd say, don't you think we need to grow? Well, we've hardly gotten anywhere yet, so let's worry about environment a little bit later on. That was very much actually, but we never said it in public, of course. But I think that climate change is such a serious phenomenon that it's something that we need to think about and do something about now. And if you look at the Sahelian region, and you look at the security threat that poses today, you will see that part of the economic devastation in those regions has part of its roots in climate change. So it is something that we have to do something about. So that's on that. Now, on the issue of consensus, I think that we no longer have the ability of an elite to impose a consensus on a society. So before, if you got the right newspapers, you got the right TV stations, a small group of people could impart a certain way of thinking to a large community. That is no longer there. There has been a process in which all of that has been broken down. But this habit, we need to ingrain the habit that we are constantly explaining, arguing, putting things across to a wider community so that a consensus evolves from that discussion. And if it evolves in that way, then it truly takes root. Part of the problem that we see with the Trump phenomenon is that a certain group of people were left out of that discussion. So it's not good enough simply to say that they are racist. It is the fact that a group of people did not benefit from globalization and were not part of that discussion. So in evolving a consensus, it is very important, that we do it wide as range as possible. Okay. On the last question to do with China, very briefly, I generally think that China is far more of a blessing than a curse. And I teach a course at Harvard Business School these days, and the China thing always comes up. And my response to it is always to say, I want to assure you that when I'm sitting in Lagos, having dinners with friends of mine, the issue of this Chinese threat is not something that comes up. I don't think I've had somebody talk about it for the last 2 or 3 years. China for us, for Africa, I believe, offers alternatives, alternative source of capital. It offers, it's a country that has produced, for example, in telecoms, handsets smartphones at prices that Ericsson, Motorola, and co. would never have done. And that's why we will be able to take off 4G, 5G in Africa in a serious way, because we now have cheap smartphones, right? It offers a different model of development. And so from my perspective, if Western countries, okay, didn't see their participation in areas like infrastructure funding, for example, why are you going on and on about this guy who's willing to do it? Now, when I'm in a very mischievous mood, which I often am, and there are a large number of English friends of mine in the room, I end by saying that from the English, it's a little bit like having taken over somebody's house. And then you leave at independence. And then you come back and warn the guy to say, you know, be careful, there's this Chinese guy who wants to take over your house. Now, I don't want to leave with that being my final say on the English. I think that in their contribution to education, in their contribution to economic development, and in their continuing interest in emerging markets, there are many fine English folks who have done an outstanding job.
So let's reflect on what we've just heard, the importance of business and government and business and government, the importance of open mindsets between African countries and people from different backgrounds, the need to be personally resilient, and much more. Can we thank Akeem for all these amazing insights? Thank you.
Thank you both so much. So we are about to add some seating to our stage and welcome our next set of speakers. But before we do, I would ask if there are any empty seats on your row, if you could move towards the middle and make space. We have people that are crowded up top that would love to take a seat if it's available. So if you could move in and bring some space, that would be very helpful to some people up at the top. And we're back. Our next discussion is going to focus on financing investment on the continent and will be facilitated by Mark Richards, who is a non-executive director and chairman of the Risk Committee at CIB Bank in Egypt. So please welcome our next set of speakers.
Thank you. In the next half hour or so, we're going to look at the private sector view of investment and the experiences of a great set of investors across the continent. I think between the panelists, we touch all corners of Africa. Between the firms involved, they have mobilized collectively more than $10 billion of private sector investment. So this is the private sector view of the questions of this morning. And our goal is to look at the operating environment from the day-to-day investor's point of view. So I'm going to start by just asking everybody to talk about their own experience of investing in Africa, what investors are saying, and how free trade might make a difference to them. If I may, I'll start with Suli, and I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves as they go. To start, so Suli, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So maybe I'll just a quick introduction about Helios. So Helios Investment Partners is today the largest private equity firm that invests exclusively in Africa. We manage a bit more than $3.5 billion, and we have investments in more than 30 countries. What's our strategy? Our approach is to really create or back market leaders that operate in key sectors in Africa, in sectors in the economy, and in key countries in Africa. Now, how do we do it? Maybe I can just pick an example. One of our investors I'll take maybe is a company called Equity Bank. Equity Bank was a bank we invested in 2007, and it was Kenya in Kenya. So Kenya is a market that has 48 banks, and we made the investment in Equity Bank. The thesis was that you had a platform that could really serve the informal sector. They were not catering to the mass, to the top of the pyramid, but really to the farmer and the informal sector. And they were only operating in Kenya. So our approach was to really back the entrepreneur to expand that model across a number of countries in Africa. And what's interesting about that model was that by providing capital and helping them expand new geographies, they went from being among the 48 banks in Kenya, having 6% market share, to having more than half of all the bank accounts in the country. More importantly was actually the way they grew was not by signing up people who had already bank accounts, but by finding people who already were not covered by the traditional banking sector. And more importantly is actually when you look at their performance, they managed to do so by becoming the third most profitable bank in the world in terms of return on equity and return on capital over a 10-year period. So this is a kind of example that kind of highlights how by backing entrepreneurs, the right business model, helping them expand across the region, you can really create a business that has a big impact in our markets, but also deliver good returns. Now, how does trade impact? How should we think about trade as a pre-investor? I think as an investor, there are a number of levels. First one, I would say that one challenge you have today, even if you have this free trade agreement, is you don't really have one country. You don't have one, most countries don't operate as a single unit. We look at, I'm from Senegal. If you look at from the north of the country to the south of the country, you have many products that are produced in one side of the country that never make it to the markets. So till you actually have a functioning market in your own country, even if you open the borders, you're going to have challenges. If you look at, for example, the importation of fertilizer in Cameroon at the port of Douala, the price between Douala and the Baltic is a difference of 10%, but between Douala to the north of the country, it's a factor of 3. Once again, before you even think about going from Cameroon to Chad, solve Cameroon itself. That's one. Now, the trade could be a big opportunity because it allows scale. So when you look at banking sector, many sectors, economy of scale is really important. And through trade, you can create clusters of scale that can really compete and also lower the overall cost structure. Because our markets are very small. So as a PE investor, I like regional platforms, creating Pan-African platforms because you can get talent, you have scale, and it has many benefits. But there's a lot to be done inside our own countries first.
Absolutely. And if I may, ask you, Babacar, build on those themes. Each of our regions in the continent have very different challenges. Can you share some of your experiences in that regard?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Maybe I'll start by introducing DPI very quickly. So DPI is very similar to Helios. We focus on Africa. Today we manage $1.1 billion, and we present in over 30 countries. Our investment strategy is around backing entrepreneurs that focuses on the emerging middle class. So in terms of sectors, we invest in education, health, FMCG, financial services, and how we do it is we want to create champions. So we back African entrepreneurs in one country, and typically what happens is we help them develop in 5, 6, 7 countries, either as a in a Pan-African setting, or in in their regions. As for myself, from Senegal, so Senegal is overrepresented in this panel today. For some reason, I don't know, but so from Senegal, born and raised in Senegal, educated in the US and UK, and I'm very glad to be here today as an alum, and to see many familiar faces. Coming back to your question, I think so. Trade is critical for us, because one thing that we really value as an investor is scale. How do you scale? As Suleiman mentioned, a lot of these countries are very small. To grow these companies, to make them successful, you need bigger markets. And a good example of that, I think personally that some of these markets are more interlinked than we think. There's been challenges in country, as Suleiman mentioned, so it's difficult sometimes to trade within one country. But what typically happens is that if you take the case of Francophone Africa, for example, thanks to the French, they've done a lot of things before the independence to integrate that region in order to trade better. But what it did is that it created we have a common FX, common law. It's highly integrated as an economy, so it's very easy to trade from Senegal to Mali to Togo and Gambia and all these countries.
And just building on that point for a second, do you believe that that free trade area really has facilitated trade? For those who are talking about the continent-wide free trade agreement, the case study of what has gone on in Francophone West Africa is an interesting one.
Yeah, no, it has facilitated trade. I mean, today, one of our strategies is to invest in multi-country companies. So, for example, we invested in a bank in Côte d'Ivoire, and that bank was set up in the late 90s. And within literally 6 years, they've been able to operate in 8 countries. Now, for Africa, I think that's quite an achievement. And that would not have been possible if the central bank wasn't the same, if the currency would not be the same. So it was very easy to scale up because of links that already exist. Now, in terms of challenges, there are challenges, as Suleiman mentioned. So we see a lot of challenges in terms of logistics, in terms of regulation, but there are ways, and we believe that's where knowing the continent, knowing how to operate in the continent comes very handy. There are ways to go around those issues, and I'll elaborate on some of them later on.
Thank you. Gita, it's often said of the private equity industry, there's plenty of money these days, there's too much dry powder in the industry. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about more than money, impact. Is that an important part of the private sector? We were hearing earlier in the conversation the relationship between government and the private sector. And we're also talking about the social aspects of building society. Can you share your experiences both facilitating capital movement, but also people skills, and how integrated are they as part of your investment thesis?
I'll start by saying I was here as a student like Babaka, but over 10 years ago, and after doing an MBA, I did a research degree on private equity as an instrument of development in Africa, because private equity has been used as an instrument of development in Africa for over 50 years. And our industry would not exist without the development finance institutions investing and continuing to invest in our industry. So that point of private sector development and using capital as a force for unlocking the positive benefits of entrepreneurship has been probably best proven on our continent compared to many other regions. So building upon that, I think a key thing to perhaps dive into is some of the sectors, and healthcare is a good example. Education is another good example, where you definitely need that interplay between the government and the private sector. Primary education, primary healthcare does not make sense for the private sector to provide, not at the price point that people are able and willing to provide. And without having that streaming effect, you can build secondary care hospitals, you can build tertiary care hospitals, But if you still have only those who can afford to come and pay to get their scrapes, their aches, and their bruises, you're going to end up in a situation which we have currently today, where we have an increase in terms of non-communicable diseases on the continent, which is lifestyle in nature for the most part, and requires a very different cost structure in terms of how you're going to be able to provide the care. So when we talk about impact, and when we talk about private equity, and when we talk about entrepreneurship on the continent, these three go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And continuing the sector theme, Bahani, you represent one of the most exciting economies in Africa at the moment, Ethiopia, with a growing manufacturing sector. And often when we talk about free trade agreements, it's manufacturing, agriculture, which are at the heart of those debates. So as you think as an investor in Ethiopia, is it the domestic market that's your focus today? And will free trade agreements change anything in your perspective and how you invest?
Okay, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Bahani Dempsey, co-founder and managing partner at CFIUS. CFIUS is primarily focused on investing in Ethiopia, but it also has some allocation for regional integration as well, which will play later on with the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We like investing in manufacturing, agro-processing, and services, which includes healthcare and education. And mostly, even though our primary focus is Ethiopia, is because we believe our competitive advantage is really the knowledge of the country rather than knowledge of the whole Pan-Africa. So in our strategy, like I said, we focus on industrialization, which really helps into moving into that free trade agreement. And we believe that what is our competitive advantage within the country to be able to add value and service the huge domestic market that we have. Ethiopia is the second largest country in terms of population in Africa at 106 million. So we have a huge domestic market that is underserved with goods and services that are currently being met through imports. And so that creates a huge opportunity for us for the domestic market. So like Suleiman said earlier on, we're focusing first on our home market, trying to service our home market, and also trying to see how we can integrate regionally with neighboring countries before developing into the Pan-African strategy.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I would just personally add, the scale of the African continent, everybody in this room knows very well. It's America, it's India, it's China, and put together in geographic terms. And physically moving goods across that sort of distance with the sort of infrastructure that's out there is as big a factor as any free trade agreement is ever going to be. So it is not surprising, I think, our panelists are all focusing first within their themes and their regions. But it's not to say that Pan-African businesses aren't being built, particularly in the services sector, where it is possible to operate by satellite or something like that across the continent. There are a number of very good examples already of Cape to Cairo businesses. And I think it's worth just bringing in the service sector into the conversation as well as the manufacturing sector. Our panelists all represent variants of theme of the private equity industry here today. And I speak as a very grey-haired member of that community. When I started, there were probably 10 serious private equity groups in Africa, which would have been 15 years ago. Today, it's well over 200, I think, at the last count, according to the African Venture Capital Association. So I would posit to the panel, it's not shortage of money that's the challenge in development. Is it that, or is it a different challenge? As you're trying to find more deals and more investments of the future, what's the constraints that you face collectively?
Mark, it feels like it's been a while since you've been out fundraising.
This is true. This is true.
I think fundraising in sub-Saharan Africa especially has been challenging. It always has been. And it also depends who you're fundraising from. So if you're fundraising from someone who is a pension fund, for example, sitting in the Midwest in the US, and they can put their dollars anywhere in the world, they need a reason to come to Africa. Because at that point, the perception of risk, the actual performance of the industry, and if you look at the performance of the industry is still relatively young. And so how many funds have been seen through to the end of the fund life? Where have you seen net fund returns? So there's a lot about the model, if we're being honest, that still is yet to be proved. We have great individual stories, and we have great belief as professionals in the industry. However, if you are administering capital on behalf of a pension fund, and you need to think about paying out pensions at a certain point in the future, that risk perception is going to very heavily weigh into your allocation. So there is a fair amount of dry capital on the continent right now. My view is partially because there's a mismatch of the risk appetite. The private equity model is also somewhat flawed in that given the duration of the funds, you are often pushed into the cycle of having to raise one fund after another quite quickly. So you need to start showing exits to start showing enough track record to go out into the market within 2 to 3 years. So as a result, it's the same deals that are being done. It's the same businesses that are moving from private equity firm to private equity firm. And that, frankly, for me, is one of the most worrying things when it comes to private equity on the continent. Because there are very few businesses which are at the top end of the size. So if we really want to grow the private sector, it's the same drum that we've been beating, right? We need to have capital going into earlier stage businesses, into small and medium-sized businesses, and to grow them. But perhaps this calls for a different structure, which is not private equity-like. We've been talking about permanent capital vehicles forever, but it's very hard to raise them because it's tough to raise the capital. And I know that Babak over here has some very strong views I agree with in terms of the role of unlocking local capital on the continent.
You have to build on that point, please.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gita. I think just before I touch on the pension fund, I think what we tend to do in the continent across multiple layers and sectors is, there's a narrative and there's reality. And I think there's a lot of narrative around, there's a lot of dry powder. At DPI, and certainly I know my friends at Helios, we don't feel that way. We feel like there's 11,000 companies today in Africa that have revenues between $20 million to $200 million, right? So there's a lot to do in terms of deployment. The key now is strategy. How are you deploying that capital? I think a lot of us tend to focus on the same things because we want, safe investment, low risk, and all of that. But I think as an industry, as we grow, we need to go deeper and be more entrepreneurial. Certainly at DPI, we're trying to do that, and I know our friends at the various other firms are trying to do that as well. So I think I just want to, put that out there that, there are opportunities. The key is, how you unlock them. And certainly we feel we've deployed 1.1 billion in 10 years. Today we're on the market, and we believe that we can, and within that's 1.1 billion is what DPI manages. Across, if you add the co-investment, we over 2 billion. We've raised 2 billion, another billion in co-investment in the continent. So I think there are no shortage of opportunities, but the key is where you focus. In terms of now unlocking, pension funds and also investors, institutional investors in Africa, I think as an industry we need to do a lot more. Because today, I was just reading an article this morning, there's about 400 billion of pension fund money available. Less than 2% goes into private equity. And I think, if we're going to develop this industry sustainably, we need to find ways to partner with our local institution. Because it's one thing, as Gita mentioned, going to the US, and we do that all the time, to convince investors there to invest, where you have a 2-hour meeting and 1 hour and 50 minutes is spent on telling the Africa story. Whereas what why invest in Africa, correlation, all of that, it's a challenge.
Absolutely.
But we're doing it, as I think a lot of successful firms are doing it. But it's a different story on Thursday when sitting at the African Development Bank, and where the story is, how was your investment in Morocco in education? What are the challenges? What do you need? How can we support? It's a different discussion altogether. And I think unlocking that will help the story a little bit more.
I just want to add maybe one more point, both in terms of the opportunity set, but also the challenges as investors. So I think first is there's a massive scarcity of capital. You know? People say there's a lot of capital, but if I were to ask you this question, is there enough money today addressing the scarcity of power in Africa? You'll tell me no. Is there enough money today to address the need for affordable education? You'll tell me no. And the list goes on. So the problem is not that there's too much money and not enough opportunities. The challenge is that people are waiting for companies that are readily prepared by Goldman Sachs. They send you offering memorandum and you buy that business. You have to actually, well, in our market, you have to think like a business builder and think like an entrepreneur. You have to create the companies yourselves. You can build many companies of scale that are Pan-African. One example is the tower sector, for example, but it applies to a number of sectors. So I think the key one is, no, it's not like PE like we were doing in the US. It is, you're going to think like an entrepreneur, and you have capital behind you. In developed markets, it is, you're a financial investor. You buy and you sell. In Africa, you build. That's number one. Number two now is, what are the challenges as an investor for us to get good returns? I think first one is, again, you buy businesses, how do you scale companies? One challenge I would say for us is management team and human capital. Can we find a good team that can actually execute? Because again, if you have the hypothesis that the market is supply short, the challenge is actually how do you execute to scale and grow the business? So people. So there are many approaches. Some of us, what we do is we partly insource that challenge by having an operating team of former CEOs, CFOs, Lean Six Sigma experts who can support portfolio companies. That's people, but people is number one for me. Number two is, what is the biggest challenge to our returns? Is currency FX. If you, ultimately, people want to deliver dollar returns. If you want to deliver a 25% dollar return year on year, but your currency depreciates 10% even year on year, that means that in local currency terms, that's 35%. Some of our markets is 40% depreciation. So how many companies can deliver that return on capital that is far in excess of 30, 40% year on year? That is the challenge. So that means for me, the other challenges are more structural. It is the inflation, it is currency depreciation. So that means the businesses you choose that have a dollarized business, currency hedge, or the business model. But for us, the challenge is not the opportunities. It is, can you have good management teams with a good business model, and how do you address the FX question?
Building on some of those points, mobilizing capital, mobilizing local capital in particular to move away from the FX risk and some of those points, seems to have been a model that, if you look at China, if you look at Latin America in particular, their economic development stories are heavily driven by their own capital formation. So China, and I'm sure there's a lot of experts in the audience, most of that development growth in the last decade of 20 years has been self-funded in China. I spent a lot of time working in Latin America, and the big contrast that always struck me with Africa was the evolution of the pension funds very quickly in markets like Chile and Colombia, and how much they became the infrastructure funders. So each region, each part of the continent has to answer that question one way or the other. And I think the Ethiopian model in particular is an interesting one because you've got a slightly more closed capital structure than some other parts of the continent. There's less international flow into Ethiopia, and it's harder for international capital to buy companies in Ethiopia. How would Ethiopia answer that question today? Where is it going to generate its capital from?
Actually, in the last 4 or 5 years, Ethiopia has been one of the highest recipients of FDI. So that story has progressed in the positive direction. But I think we have actually tried with CFIUS whether to mobilize local capital or not, because within Ethiopia, when somebody has enough excess cash, they don't think about going to investments. And like we think about, they think real estate, buildings, homes. I mean, it's all like, it's not in a productive sector of the economy because they don't have the mechanism of actually deploying capital into somebody's business and not get involved. So we found that there's a lot of capital within the country that we could utilize for investments in the country, but the regulation, the tax systems, the accounting status in managing a fund-like structure within the country was not there. and with the capital account controls as well of taking out dollars of Ethiopians from the country.
And are you an optimist that that's going to change? I mean,
Absolutely.
we've talked about government, private sector
we're in the
collaboration. Is that a
actually
different
we're
story 10 years'
in
time?
the process of reviewing our commercial codes and investment laws, and what they've done is they've distributed the draft to the private sector for comments, which is really great opportunity for all of us to be engaged in. So countries have to evolve and have to, be competitive. We're talking about the free trade agreement, and we can no longer be protectionists of that kind of capital. So very positive about things changing and laws being amended towards that.
And Gito, I know that you're involved in the Botswanan initiatives to mobilize local capital. And perhaps you could just expand a little bit on how the evolved pension fund industry and the government is working with the private sector there.
Would be happy to, but just to piggyback off the point that Berhani just made, she and I met 10 years ago here in London, and she came to talk to me because there was a transaction that she was looking for co-investment on in the cement industry in Ethiopia. And she told me she'd knocked on the doors of my colleagues in Kenya, and they said, sorry, Ethiopia, it's a no-go for us. So back to Hakeem's point from earlier, even within Africa, we need to overcome our own reluctance to go into areas that we wouldn't normally go into. I mean, I became the biggest advocate for investing in Ethiopia within our firm. I opened up that market for us as a firm because my Kenyan colleagues were absolutely convinced that it was not possible to invest in Ethiopia. So I think there's a bit of resistance that we definitely need to overcome ourselves. In the case of Botswana, it's been the other way around. So Botswana is a small country in terms of the population. We're 2.3 million people. But by many yardsticks, it's a very successful country. But it's a country that has not really attracted a lot of private equity investments. I know, Babaka, you've got an investment there. But that one investment has been an investment that a number of with other co-investors, other private equity firms have invested in. But, we have 16 companies listed on the stock exchange, 6, and one's just about to come off. So the Botswana Public Officers Pension Fund decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands, and they decided to set up to back 2 fund managers, putting $50 million into each one. And the focus of those funds was to only invest in Botswana. There's a grand total of about 5 of us from Botswana with private equity experience. So the pension fund approached us all, and in some way, shape, or form, all of us are involved in those 2 funds. I'm on the investment committee of one of those, Aleo Capital. And this is an example of where a local pension fund said, actually, enough is enough. If we're going to want to see capital being deployed, from the alternative side, we're going to have to make these investments ourselves. And usually, the Botswana Public Officers Pension Fund will not write a ticket for less than $100 million into a fund. So they had to make changes internally. And we're in the first year of this, and we're very hopeful that this is going to work out well. And it's allowing these fund managers also to think about what is the next generation for us to expand within SADC. How do we leverage what is happening from a political perspective, where Botswana is trying to become a safe haven in the same way Mauritius has for the fund industry? How can we now leverage the fact that there's finally going to be a bridge built at the Kazangula border between Botswana and Zambia, where before we had a ferry that would go down quite frequently? So, it's about, again, getting public and private to work together.
Thank you. I'd like to hear just the Francophone West African perspective, and then I think we'll throw questions open to the audience for the balance. So in your region, you've got the integrated free trade area, you've got a common currency. Where is the capital going to come from for future growth, funding infrastructure and things? Is it the sorts of things that Gito has described, or is it a different answer?
I think it's a mix. First, I think there are good advantages that the West African Francophone region has, and it's through this very stable currency. So today it is pegged to the euro, and the peg has been stable since 1994. And inflation across the region is around 2%. So as a result, you can actually take long-term hard currency capital and make investments in our market. So that's something you could not do in many other countries in Africa because you have 20% depreciation year on year. So because of that stable monetary framework, you have both domestic pools of capital that are available, but also international pools of capital, and you can hedge that currency. So I think that's number one. Now, in terms of domestic sources, a number of the countries are beginning to have their own small sovereign wealth funds, but today their prime focus is in the domestic market. So that's going to change over time. But I think really the biggest asset they have is really that the monetary union and the stability of the currency, and you can look at it as one large market, because you have the OHADA region, so it's under the same law. There's a lot of movement of labor and people across the country. So if you go to University of Dakar, you see people from all over West Africa studying there, and then they return home. So, but I think for us, you do have access to the domestic market as well because you have the BRVM exchange. Now, the exchange is small and not liquid, but it's a good place to issue debt. So if you have an investment and you raise debt capital, you can securitize debt actually in those markets, which is not the case in many of our other jurisdictions. But now, there's still a lot to do. There's still a lot to do, right? So, but we do have a favorable framework, though.
Very good. Anything to add to that, though?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing to add there, I think, maybe just focus a bit on the challenges because Soleil did a good job on the benefit. The challenges are, the regulation. So if you look at, it takes a while we tried IPOing a company to exit through that market, and it takes 18 months just to get your paperwork ready. So there's a lot of bureaucracy. They need to streamline. The ease of doing business. The ease of doing business need to be improved. But as a market, I totally agree. It's 100 million people, same common law, same currency, easy. And people are there's a lot of movement between the countries. So finding talent also is relatively easy. But the key is unlocking, working with government. I think the key here, Akeem touched on it, is how government now and business can sit together and come up with a plan that makes sense to develop some of this area that needs money.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think that's a very good place to pause. So there you have it. That's the practitioner's view of deploying capital. Let's take some questions from the audience. I don't know where the cube is, but...
Get this. Hi, my name is Samuel. In regards to capital, education, all these things are really in GDP. My question is, do you think there's any sort of possibility of reinventing GDP from Africa that creates a new narrative for the rest of the world? That's my question. Simple.
Any volunteers on that one?
I'd love to actually pick that up.
Yes.
And this is off of the keynote that was given by Arun Maute yesterday. Why don't we start with unlocking the power of women? Over 80% of the consumption choices is in the hands of women on the continent today. Yesterday the IFC released a report which looked at gender within the private equity industry. And what they found is not what you see here. So what they found is actually only 11% of us in emerging markets private equity in senior management are female. But where there was more gender balance, the returns from the investments were higher by 20% on a net IRR basis. 20%. So I think one thing that we can really do is if you want to change the GDP narrative in Africa, is let's engage the women. And I think Berhane is a fantastic example of someone who's already doing that.
Thank you. A very interesting perspective. I'm going to keep going. So the lady in the third row.
Hi, yes. So I'm from Botswana. My name is Thokozile Tembo, and I'm from Botswana and Zambia. And I'm interested to know what you think would be the best opportunities for investment in terms of the sectors of emerging markets like Botswana and Zambia. What sectors would be ideal for investment, especially given the fact that a country like Botswana has such a small market? And how do you get around being able to leverage those markets? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that one's one.
Yeah. The theme of the conference today has been about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Currently, 18% of exports of African countries is traded within Africa, 1/8. And the equivalent within Europe is 69%. The equivalent within Asia is 59%. 70% of our exports as African countries is actually in commodities. So there's a piece here that we haven't quite touched on, which is the correlation of opening up trade and the necessity of building up industrialization. Now, if you look at Botswana, we were able to get the diamond cutting center back from London to Gaborone. So what else can we do to actually retain? We're going back to an argument and a discussion we've been having for 20 years, which is how do we retain more of the value chain on the continent? I think that in combination with the opening up of the markets is what's going to yield even more opportunities. If you think about the beef industry in Botswana, which is exporting to Europe, and then next door you have beef which is being imported from New Zealand. So with your coffee, it's the same thing with your coffee.
And the beans and other African countries import the roasted coffee. So,
so therein lie the opportunities. And to Sulei's point as well, it's about being a builder. And for many of us, we get approached a lot by young people who are interested in going into the private equity industry. And for me, I think what is far more interesting and sexier is actually being the entrepreneur, building those businesses.
I'm going to keep moving. Gentleman with the blue box.
Oh, hi there. My name is Winston. I do project finance projects around the world. And my question, I guess, to the panel is about your sources of funding. At the beginning of my career, I did a lot of work with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So a lot of the funding there was always backstopped by export credit agencies and development finance institutions. In the Middle East, it was backstopped again by organizations like the Islamic Development Bank, which happens to have quite a lot of members who are from Africa. And I just wondered whether there were any structures in Helios or DPI or LGT which sort of think about maybe blending some of your funding sources from not just being backstopped against Goldman Sachs, but maybe the Islamic Development Bank, who maybe with their Sharia compliant or Sharia principles may have the sort of patience just naturally that maybe some of the Western organizations may not always have because of the way they're structured.
So DFI is part of your funding sources?
So I'll touch funding source from 2 points of view, both from the fund itself and then from the point of view of the companies we invest in. So from the fund itself, for Helios, for example, our first fund came through the support of DFIs, right, from the IFC, OPIC, and other institutions. Over time, as we went to our third fund, it became around 95% came from private capital, meaning pension funds and institutions. That being said, in our investment, we still do collaborate with many DFIs, but it always starts with what's our investment thesis, what are we trying to create, and then what parts do we need to bring to the table, right? So if we're going to do something in agribusiness, maybe it's going to be the FDB, or it could be something in Europe because they have some expertise, they have technical assistance, and they may have the right type of funding for that business. So for our view is always start with the business first. But now in terms of the capital structure for our companies, that is actually the case. When I think about our investment in the tower sector, some comes from bank funding, some comes from bond funding, but part of the funding comes also from development organizations. Do I have a mandate might be in access to information, might be their mandate is focusing on access to renewable energy, and what we do is we get that funding to invest in solar panels and hybrid batteries so you don't use diesel generators to kind of help the environment. So there are many ways actually we do partner with institutions, and it doesn't even stop there because there was this question about China earlier. Quite often many of our companies would import raw materials from China, transform it, and sell to the local market. So you start building strategic partnerships with actually the suppliers of the chain, and you work through export credit and financing to finance your working capital. So there are actually a number of creative ways where you can finance the businesses themselves, but also finance your fund itself.
Thank you.
Do your funders give you enough time to play with the Rubik's Cube, if you want, in terms of there are some situations which just have to play out over time. If you're on like 5-year money or 7-year money,
Yes. That is correct. On the equity capital size, both on debt and equity, I would say, on the equity, generally like a 10-year life, right? So 10 plus 1 plus 1 up to 12 years. On the debt, you do have a constraint on tenor. Now, the constraint on tenor really comes from the underlying, I would say, currency volatility. If you are in the CFA zone, you can have a long-dated tenor that's even hedged by OPIC for 30 years. If I go to Nigeria, when you have inflation at those rates and treasuries are in the double digit, if you compound it over 10 years, you're never going to pay it back. So there are some structural challenges you have on the funding structure, but you do have partners who are willing to work with you.
I'm going to try and push in a couple more questions. We've only got 5 minutes left. I think there's some questions about the gentleman in the blue shirt with the hand up there.
Question to the panel is impact a core part of the investment thesis, and how much effort and time and resource do you put to measure and manage to it?
Can we have a quick, very short answer to that one?
Sorry. For us, we have a dedicated team that does the measurement. Impact is in every investment that we make. So the challenge is not finding where we make impact. It's really making the time and investment to measure it and report it. So we do have a separate team that's dedicated to impact measurement.
So very similar. I think my view on impact, so we all collectively, I think, do a lot of things on impact because of the DFI backing. So, a lot of us have DFI money. I think where the key is now agreeing on what's impact and how to measure it. And I think that's where we need to collectively, think about how to best effectively do it. But impact is key. I think when you're building a business in Africa, you're doing impact.
I think it's a license to do business, frankly, for all people in the industry, and all of the private equity industry is committed, I think, these days. A question right at the very back. Yes. So.
Here? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Nick. I'm a Kenyan, South African. I come from a strategy consulting background. So KKR recently closed one of their largest Africa-focused funds, citing that they don't have companies large enough to invest in. Do you guys struggle with that? And do you think that, this kind of idea of Western management philosophy has to change when coming to Africa from not just a strategy consulting standpoint, but from an investment standpoint also? And what are you guys doing around that? So if KKR, with all of their money, can't find big enough deals, is that a function of the way KKR sees deals? Would they have to change their perspective on that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll maybe briefly touch on that point, which is that, and I think you touched, which is maybe the way they approach deals has to be different in Africa, right? Again, it's not a market where you go in. So I would compare, in the US, you go to a supermarket and say, what's on sale? In Africa, you go to a farm, there's a field full of diamonds, but you have to do the work. So the key is you got to figure out what are the opportunities and can I build a business of scale? So it's about building businesses and helping them scale. When you look at our portfolio, if you run a screen anywhere on Bloomberg or any data, most of these companies, you looked at them 5 years ago or 10 years ago, did not exist. And they're all multi-$100 million businesses today. Why? It's either you built those businesses or they are non-core businesses for multinationals. Senegal in itself is a small country in itself. But if you look at the entire region, what you'll see is there are a number of businesses that have a presence across West Africa. And when you aggregate that business and you create a standalone company, it's a sizable platform. So the key is not about, again, going to the supermarket and saying what's for sale. It's about what is a large unmet need that is modular and scalable. I can have a good return on capital, and I have a team behind it. And for those opportunities, actually, it is vast. But you have to be an entrepreneur, and you have to be very creative.
Thanks, Uli. I'm going to try and get one last question right at the back at the left corner there. We'll try for two if we're quick.
Thank you.
I'll try to go around the floor here.
Okay. My question is for the idea of a single market, global outcomes as we're talking, and the sort of disparate perspectives. On the one hand, West Africa and a rather unified region, and on the other hand, Botswana and Ethiopia. Of dare I say, a single African currency, or if considering in another single market we might be familiar with, this poses more challenges than opportunities for investing.
I think as you touched on using the EU as an euro as an example, I think a single currency is just the final step. Once you have free movement of capital, labor, and you've got to be able to have a consolidated fiscal policy. Yep. Here's the challenge you have. Let's just look at West Africa. Nigeria's GDP is 15 times that of Senegal, and a big part of it comes from oil. If you integrate Nigeria with the Francophone zone, with just the movement in oil prices and a change in oil production, it has a cascading effect across the entire region.
So not this decade, I think.
Not this decade. And if they do it, it will be a mistake.
Which I'm afraid is the note we're going to have to.
The point of a single currency is what is the utility of a single currency? And can we get to it without having to fight over whose face is going to appear on the note? So why don't we talk about actually what is happening in terms of blockchain? Why don't we talk about what has been happening with Equity Bank and the use of mobile communications and what that unlocks from a financial services perspective? So I think for me, it's less about a single currency and more about how can we get financial inclusion in a very, very different way.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw a line there. I'm very conscious there's a large number of questions in the audience. The panelists will be around. And let me just finish by saying thank you for a tour de force tour of the continent and capital markets. So thank you, everyone.
I have a couple of quick announcements before we move on to our lunch break. The first is that the Branding the Africa Narrative session will begin promptly at 12:50 in one of our other lecture theaters. And so if you're interested in joining for that, we encourage you to go there straight away. There will be a chance to eat lunch after, but if you're interested in that discussion, we invite you to go there